April 1945, the war was nearly over, but Germany was still burning. A thin veil of smoke drifted through the ruins of a small Bavarian town, once home to cobbled streets, laughter, and the sound of church bells that no one had heard in months. Windows were shattered, roofs torn apart. The air smelled of damp ashes and cold stone. American soldiers moved carefully through what remained, rifles slung low, eyes wary but tired. They had fought too long to still feel triumph. Amid the wreckage stood what had once been the heart of the town. A church. Its steeple collapsed, its wooden cross buried beneath debris. A small group of German women stood nearby, shawls wrapped around thin shoulders, watching in silence. They expected commands, perhaps suspicion, maybe punishment, but one American soldier broke formation. He set his rifle aside, stepped forward, and bent to lift a fallen beam. Others followed. Dust rose, sunlight pierced through broken glass, and in that fragile silence, something changed. It was not a battle. It was the beginning of rebuilding what war had tried to erase. By the spring of 1945, the German Reich was collapsing under its own weight. What had once been the mightiest war machine in Europe was now reduced to fragments of broken cities and broken spirits. Allied forces pushed deeper into German territory from the west, the Soviets from the east. Between them lay a landscape that no longer resembled a nation. Only endless ruins, hunger, and silence. The Allied bombing campaigns of 1943 to 1945 had left entire towns unrecognizable. Cologne, Dresden, Hamburg, Würzburg, cities that had stood for centuries were now fields of rubble. In many small towns, the destruction was just as severe, but received little mention in the headlines. Villages that had never seen frontline combat were struck by bombers targeting railways, factories, and bridges. Civilian homes and churches were caught in the firestorms. By April, most able-bodied German men were either dead, captured, or still fighting hopeless battles on the front lines. What remained behind were women, children, and the elderly, the last caretakers of a defeated nation. They tried to hold together what was left of life, finding food, tending to the wounded, and burying the dead. But beyond survival, there was little they could do. The war had taken not only their homes, but also their sense of faith and belonging. For German women, especially those living in the towns of southern Germany, the arrival of American troops brought both fear and confusion. Propaganda had painted Allied soldiers as monsters, brutal conquerors who would destroy whatever was left. So when the first U.S. patrols entered these ruined towns, many women hid in basements, clutching their children and praying silently that they would be spared. But what they saw in the following days was different from what they had been told. The American soldiers were cautious but restrained. Many were young, barely in their 20s, and as weary of killing as the civilians were of war. They searched for weapons, rounded up remaining Nazi officers, and secured supply routes. Yet once the fighting ended, something unexpected happened. The guns fell silent, and a different kind of order began. The U.S. military administration, operating under General Dwight D. Eisenhower's directives, had a clear mission: to occupy, disarm, and stabilize Germany. But Eisenhower also understood something deeper. The war had not only destroyed an enemy, it had destroyed a people's spirit. If there was to be peace, it could not be built solely on punishment. It needed understanding, structure, and humanity. So as American divisions moved through Bavaria and the Rhineland, military engineers, chaplains, and medical units began what was called civil affairs. They repaired bridges, reopened hospitals, and distributed food to civilians who had nothing left. The policy was simple: stabilize first, then rebuild. In many towns, churches became symbols of that fragile hope. They were among the most visible casualties of Allied bombing: spires broken, altars burned, bells melted into silence. Yet for civilians, The church was not just a building. It was a link to the past, a place where generations had marked births, weddings, and farewells. Rebuilding it, even in part, meant reclaiming a piece of their humanity. Reports from 1945 describe how U.S. Army chaplains often organized Sunday services in the ruins of churches, inviting both soldiers and civilians. Sometimes they would find a local pastor or priest still alive, standing amid the rubble with a Bible charred by the fires. The service might be held under a roofless nave, with sunlight falling through the gaps where stained glass once glowed. It was not triumph. It was remembrance. The moral weight of the war hung heavy on both sides. American soldiers who had seen the concentration camps, Dachau, Buchenwald, or Druf, carried images they could never unsee. Yet in the same land, they now met civilians who were hungry, frightened, and grieving. The lines between enemy and victim began to blur. In one small Bavarian town, weeks after the surrender, a chaplain wrote in his diary, "The women asked if they could rebuild their church. They had no tools, no wood, only hands and tears. We lent them our shovels." That quiet moment, an act of shared labor between conqueror and conquered, captured something rare in the ashes of war: mercy. And it was only the beginning of a larger transformation, one that would reshape the relationship between occupiers and the occupied. By the spring of 1945, the German Reich was collapsing under its own weight. What had once been the mightiest war machine in Europe was now reduced to fragments of broken cities and broken spirits. Allied forces pushed deeper into German territory from the west, the Soviets from the east. Between them lay a landscape that no longer resembled a nation. Only endless ruins, hunger, and silence. The Allied bombing campaigns of 1943 to 1945 had left entire towns unrecognizable. Cologne, Dresden, Hamburg, Würzburg, cities that had stood for centuries were now fields of rubble. In many small towns, the destruction was just as severe, but received little mention in the headlines. Villages that had never seen frontline combat were struck by bombers targeting railways, factories, and bridges. Civilian homes and churches were caught in the firestorms. By April, most able-bodied German men were either dead, captured, or still fighting hopeless battles on the front lines. What remained behind were women, children, and the elderly, the last caretakers of a defeated nation. They tried to hold together what was left of life, finding food, tending to the wounded, and burying the dead. But beyond survival, there was little they could do. The war had taken not only their homes, but also their sense of faith and belonging. For German women, especially those living in the towns of southern Germany, the arrival of American troops brought both fear and confusion. Propaganda had painted Allied soldiers as monsters, brutal conquerors who would destroy whatever was left. So when the first U.S. patrols entered these ruined towns, many women hid in basements, clutching their children and praying silently that they would be spared. But what they saw in the following days was different from what they had been told. The American soldiers were cautious but restrained. Many were young, barely in their 20s, and as weary of killing as the civilians were of war. They searched for weapons, rounded up remaining Nazi officers, and secured supply routes. Yet once the fighting ended, something unexpected happened. The guns fell silent, and a different kind of order began. The U.S. military administration, operating under General Dwight D. Eisenhower's directives, had a clear mission: to occupy, disarm, and stabilize Germany. But Eisenhower also understood something deeper. The war had not only destroyed an enemy, it had destroyed a people's spirit. If there was to be peace, it could not be built solely on punishment. It needed understanding, structure, and humanity. So as American divisions moved through Bavaria and the Rhineland, military engineers, chaplains, and medical units began what was called civil affairs. They repaired bridges, reopened hospitals, and distributed food to civilians who had nothing left. The policy was simple: stabilize first, then rebuild. In many towns, churches became symbols of that fragile hope. They were among the most visible casualties of Allied bombing: spires broken, altars burned, bells melted into silence. Yet for civilians, the church was not just a building. It was a link to the past, a place where generations had marked births, weddings, and farewells. Rebuilding it, even in part, meant reclaiming a piece of their humanity. Reports from 1945 describe how U.S. Army chaplains often organized Sunday services in the ruins of churches, inviting both soldiers and civilians. Sometimes they would find a local pastor or priest still alive, standing amid the rubble with a Bible charred by the fires. The service might be held under a roofless nave, with sunlight falling through the gaps where stained glass once glowed. It was not triumph. It was remembrance. The moral weight of the war hung heavy on both sides. American soldiers who had seen the concentration camps, Dachau, Buchenwald, Ohrdruf, carried images they could never unsee. In one small Bavarian town, weeks after the surrender, a chaplain wrote in his diary, "The women asked if they could rebuild their church. They had no tools, no wood, only hands and tears. We lent them our shovels." That quiet moment, an act of shared labor between conqueror and conquered, captured something rare in the ashes of war: mercy. And it was only the beginning of a larger transformation, one that would reshape the relationship between occupiers and the occupied. When Germany finally surrendered on May 8, 1945, silence spread across Europe. But it was not a peaceful silence. It was the sound of exhaustion, disbelief, and loss. In many German towns, church bells remained broken, so there was no sound to mark the end of the war. The streets were lined with rubble. Hunger haunted every corner, and millions of civilians faced an uncertain future under foreign occupation. The Allied forces divided Germany into zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. The American zone stretched across Bavaria, Hesse, and parts of Württemberg, regions where many of the most powerful Nazi figures had fled to hide. But for the people who lived there, the immediate concern was not politics or ideology. It was survival. In the early months of occupation, the U.S. Army faced a humanitarian crisis. Food supplies were scarce, sanitation had collapsed, and disease threatened to spread. Military leaders quickly realized that victory on the battlefield meant nothing if chaos consumed the civilian population. So they established the Office of Military Government for Germany, OMGUS, tasked with restoring basic order and rebuilding civil society. But beyond policies and logistics, there was a deeper mission: rebuilding the moral and cultural fabric of a defeated nation. Denazification programs began almost immediately. Schools reopened, newspapers were reprinted under Allied supervision, and local leaders were vetted for past Nazi affiliations. Yet even as new structures formed, the emotional void remained. For civilians, particularly women, life had become an unending test of endurance. German women, known later as Trümmerfrauen or rubble women, became the backbone of the country's physical recovery. In cities like Berlin, Munich, and Nuremberg, they cleared debris brick by brick, salvaging anything usable. Many were widows or mothers whose sons had died in the war. With bare hands and worn gloves, they rebuilt the skeletons of cities that once stood proud. For these women, the church symbolized something they could not easily abandon. Even in defeat, even after learning the horrors committed in their nation's name, the church represented forgiveness, or at least the hope of it. Yet many churches lay in ruins, their sanctuaries open to the sky, their crosses shattered on the ground. In the American zone, several chaplains recognized the spiritual despair that lingered among civilians. Major George B. Davis, a U.S. Army chaplain stationed in southern Germany, wrote in his report, "We found that the people no longer prayed. They could not. Their faith was buried under the rubble with their dead. So the Americans began something unusual for an occupying army. They helped rebuild what the war had destroyed, even when it belonged to the enemy. Engineers from the U.S. Army Corps began assisting local volunteers in repairing public buildings, water systems, and occasionally, churches, not for propaganda, but for stability. If the towns could return to routine, to work, to school, to worship, the threat of unrest would diminish. Sometimes it was unofficial. Soldiers would lend a hand after hours, moved by what they saw. There were reports of GIs helping women lift stones, offering food rations to children who watched from behind walls. One unit in Würzburg collected leftover lumber from army barracks and delivered it to a nearby town to repair a church roof. Acts like these were small, often undocumented, but deeply symbolic. They marked the first human bridge between two worlds that had spent years trying to annihilate each other. For many German civilians, especially women who had lost everything, these gestures shattered the myths of hatred that Nazi propaganda had built. And in a few towns, something even more remarkable occurred: collaboration. The very people who had feared the Allied soldiers began working beside them, sharing tools, food, and stories. The walls of enmity cracked open just enough for compassion to pass through. As one German woman later recalled, "We thought they would destroy what was left. Instead, they helped us rebuild it." That was when we knew the war was truly over. From the ashes of surrender emerged the first fragile steps of reconciliation. And among the ruins, the sound of hammers on stone became a new kind of hymn, the sound of faith returning to life. War strips away identity until all that's left are numbers. Casualties, refugees, prisoners. But in post-war Germany, the human story lay in the quiet persistence of those who survived. In towns like Aschaffenburg, Würzburg, and Regensburg, women emerged from the ruins not as symbols, but as laborers. They were no longer wives or mothers of soldiers. They were the last citizens of a collapsed nation. They carried bricks where there were no men to carry them, rebuilt walls where their faith had been shattered, and buried the idea that victory or defeat could ever erase grief. The American soldiers who met them were equally human beneath their uniforms. Many were farm boys from Kansas, mechanics from Detroit, or teachers from Ohio. They had marched across half the world, lost friends in Normandy, Ardennes, and the Rhine. When they entered Germany, they expected hostility, perhaps revenge. Instead, they found people who looked not unlike their own families: thin, weary, and hungry. Private Harold Stevens, stationed near Schweinfurt, wrote in his letter home, "You expect to hate them, but when you see the old women digging through ashes for bread, the hate sort of runs out." His words captured the unspoken transformation occurring across occupied Germany. Where ideology had once divided, exhaustion and humanity began to connect. The faces of the defeated and the victors met in the dust of the same streets. For the German women, seeing an American soldier lift a stone instead of a rifle was disarming. Not in a military sense, but in the emotional sense. It stripped away the last walls of fear. And that human contact, a glance, a nod, a helping hand, did more to heal than any political directive could. In that fragile alliance of compassion, the rebuilding of faith began. For many American soldiers, the moral aftermath of victory was complex. They had witnessed unspeakable atrocities. The liberation of camps like Dachau and Buchenwald revealed the depths of cruelty that had thrived under the Nazi regime. Anger was natural, disgust justified. Yet here they stood, among civilians who had lived under that same system, now helpless, starving, and afraid. Some soldiers struggled with the contradiction. How do you reconcile justice with mercy? How do you punish evil without losing your humanity? General Eisenhower's orders were clear. Discipline must remain absolute. Looting, harassment, or abuse of civilians was forbidden. Yet Eisenhower also spoke of restraint. "We are soldiers, not savages," he wrote in a directive circulated among his staff. The moral challenge was not about winning the war, that part was done, but about what kind of peace would follow. Would the victors become what they had fought against, or could they set a different example? The rebuilding of that bombed church became a metaphor for that moral question. Helping the defeated did not mean forgiving their crimes. It meant refusing to be consumed by them. Each act of kindness became a small declaration that morality could survive total war. One U.S. chaplain later wrote, "We had destroyed their towns, but we could still help restore their souls." It was not absolution. It was a decision that the only way forward was to prove that decency outlasts destruction. The destruction of churches across Germany had been one of the most visible symbols of the war's spiritual toll. In many towns, church steeples were the tallest landmarks, perfect targets for bombers navigating by sight. What was meant as military necessity became, to civilians, a symbol of divine silence. When the bombs stopped falling, the churches lay open to the sky, pews splintered, crucifixes blackened, altars buried in dust. Services were held outdoors or in makeshift chapels. Pastors who had survived the war spoke softly. Their congregations reduced to handfuls of widows and orphans. For the Americans, many of whom were raised in their own churches back home, the sight was haunting. It reminded them of Sunday mornings in small towns thousands of miles away. In a letter to his wife, one GI wrote, "There's a church here without a roof. The women sweep the floor every morning like it still matters. Maybe it does." That simple act, sweeping the floor of a ruined church, became a quiet testament of endurance. Faith, even bruised, refused to die. When American soldiers joined the effort to rebuild one of those churches, it was more than construction. It was communion without ceremony. The work transcended language. Hammer blows replaced hymns. Shared labor became a kind of prayer. In that rubble, two sides that had prayed for each other's destruction began rebuilding the same house of God. And as one local priest later wrote, "Sisi Torah Samao Kaudan Prone," it was the first time since 1939 that we prayed without fear. The sound of rebuilding was not just restoration, it was redemption. When the guns went silent, the engineers went to work. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had been responsible for building bridges, clearing mines, and constructing field bases during the war. But after Germany's surrender, their mission shifted overnight, from destruction to restoration. In dozens of Bavarian and Rhineland towns, the Corps turned its logistical discipline toward rebuilding civilian life. Roads were cleared, power lines repaired, and water systems restored. The same bulldozers that had once carved out tank paths were now used to clear debris from marketplaces and churchyards. The ruined church that stood at the center of one small town was typical of the challenge. Its outer walls were still upright, but its roof had caved in. Every rainstorm sent torrents of water into the nave. Wooden beams lay splintered beneath the altar, and the stained glass windows had been blown out entirely. U.S. engineers surveyed the structure for safety. Their training was technical, not spiritual, yet the task carried both weight and symbolism. The soldiers measured, reinforced, and drew plans for temporary scaffolding. They had neither the time nor the budget for full reconstruction, but they could stabilize the walls, keep the past from collapsing completely. Local women volunteered immediately. They had no machinery, only shovels and baskets, yet they carried the rubble piece by piece. The Americans watched at first, then joined in. Together, they moved hundreds of stones in a single afternoon. The sound of labor echoed through the empty streets, blending with the calls of crows overhead. In reports from the 12th Army Group's Civil Affairs Branch, Officers noted how such cooperative work reduced tension between troops and civilians. Manual reconstruction, one officer wrote, proved to be one of the most effective tools of psychological disarmament. It wasn't just engineering. It was quiet diplomacy conducted through hammers and ropes, rebuilding a physical space while repairing unseen wounds. Culture in war divides. Culture in peace can heal. In 1945, many Americans arrived in Germany expecting hatred. Yet, to their surprise, interactions with civilians were often subdued, even courteous. The exhaustion of total defeat had drained bitterness from most people. Hunger and cold replaced ideology. What emerged was a cautious willingness to coexist. The rebuilding of the church became a cultural bridge. It wasn't officially sanctioned. It grew from shared human need. The women wanted their church back. The soldiers wanted a task that reminded them of home. During breaks, they would exchange small things: bread, cigarettes, photographs. One woman offered an American soldier a cup of barley coffee made over a tin stove. He offered her a chocolate ration in return. They didn't speak the same language, but gestures replaced words. Some soldiers attended Sunday gatherings among the ruins. The hymns were foreign, but the emotion wasn't. A U.S. chaplain noted how the civilians would bow their heads when American officers entered the space, not out of fear, but respect. For many Germans, these moments redefined the image of the enemy. The propaganda-fueled hatred melted away when they saw these same men lifting stones beside them, joking softly, or helping a child who'd scraped her knee. And for the Americans, these interactions planted the first seeds of empathy toward a nation they had been taught to despise. The culture of victory gave way to the culture of responsibility. The occupiers became caretakers. Across the American zone, similar stories repeated. GIs helping rebuild schools, sharing music records, or teaching children simple English phrases. From this unlikely friendship, a quiet, cultural transformation began. These early gestures, small and personal, would later evolve into formal programs like the Marshall Plan and transatlantic partnerships. But their origins were humble, in the act of rebuilding a single church together, one beam at a time. The end of a war does not end the war inside people. For both Americans and Germans, the psychological aftermath was profound. Soldiers who had seen the front lines carried trauma that no medal could erase. Civilians who had survived the bombings lived with constant fear of sirens, of strangers, of silence. In this fragile post-war space, the act of rebuilding became therapy. Each shovel of dirt, each stone lifted, gave a rhythm to the days that had lost all meaning. Work filled the void where grief might have consumed them. For the German women, rebuilding the church was not just about faith. It was about reclaiming identity. They could not undo the war, but they could restore a piece of what made them human. For the American soldiers, helping their former enemies allowed them to soften the edges of their own trauma. After years of destruction, construction felt like a kind of absolution. Psychologists later studying post-war Europe noted that cooperative reconstruction often accelerated emotional recovery. It replaced guilt with purpose, fear with familiarity. In some cases, soldiers who had participated in rebuilding efforts reported lower instances of combat-related anxiety. When the bell was finally reinstalled, a smaller, donated one from another village. The sound was fragile, but pure. It echoed across the valley, through broken streets, over quiet fields. German women cried. American soldiers stood still, unsure what to feel. In that single moment, the war felt truly over. Not because governments had signed papers, but because people had chosen to heal. And so, in the shadow of their greatest tragedy, both sides began to rediscover something they had almost forgotten: the simple, stubborn endurance of the human spirit. The American engineers stayed longer than they had planned. What began as a simple structural repair evolved into a partnership, a quiet alliance between former enemies now bound by the ruins around them. Each day, more townspeople emerged from hiding. Men offered timber, women brought bread and coffee brewed from barley, and children carried stones in their tiny hands, eager to be part of something that felt like rebirth. The soldiers didn't fully understand the German words spoken to them, but they understood the meaning in people's eyes. Gratitude, relief, a need to believe that humanity had survived the war. One afternoon, as the new roof beams were lifted into place, an old man named Carl approached Captain Reynolds. He had been a school teacher before the war, a quiet intellectual who had seen his students drafted, his home destroyed, and his faith tested. He stood beside the captain, watching the workers below. Then, with a trembling voice, he said, "I taught my pupils that the world would learn from its mistakes. Perhaps this is the lesson." Reynolds said nothing. He simply placed a hand on Carl's shoulder, watching as the cross, salvaged from the wreckage, was hoisted back atop the church. The next morning, the town gathered for what was not a service, but a silence. The church was still missing windows, and soot marked the walls. But the bell rang for the first time in years. Some wept openly. Others just stood, eyes closed, as the sound echoed through the valley. No longer a call to prayer, but to peace. Word of the Reconstruction spread beyond the town. Journalists passing through photographed the scene. American soldiers standing beside German villagers under a rising cross. The image appeared in post-war newspapers, a symbol of something fragile and rare: reconciliation. In letters home, soldiers wrote about it differently. Private Harold Lentz, a farm boy from Ohio, described the day in his journal. "It wasn't about rebuilding a church. It was about proving to ourselves that we were still human. We tore so much apart in this war: towns, lives, faith. Lifting that roof felt like lifting something heavier than timber. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was hope." For the Germans, the memory of that moment lingered. In later years, many of the same villagers would place flowers each anniversary near the foundation stone, engraved with a simple message in both English and German: "Rebuilt not in victory, but in peace." That inscription outlived most of the men who placed it there. By the 1950s, the Marshall Plan had transformed the economy, cities had been rebuilt, and children once born under bombs were now students in bright new classrooms. But in that small town, the story of the Americans who rebuilt the church remained sacred, told quietly, like a prayer. Even decades later, when veterans returned to Europe as old men, some visited the site. They found the church still standing, clean, white, and filled with light. A young pastor would greet them at the door and say, "You are always welcome here." What once stood as a monument to suffering had become a sanctuary of shared memory. And though the world would go on to fight other wars and forget other lessons, in that corner of Germany, the bell still tolled each Sunday, its echoes carrying across the valley like a whisper from 1945, reminding anyone who listened that even in the ruins of hatred, compassion can rise again. The story did not end with the rebuilding of a building. It ended with the rebuilding of trust, a far rarer and more fragile structure.